Hey guys, Chris the Lazy Geek here and welcome back to the channel. If you're a beginner in astrophotography, one piece of advice that you probably heard is that the best way to get started into astrophotography is to use a small refracting telescope like this one, or maybe like the Red Cat here. Or if you're feeling a bit like adventurous, you could even replace the objective lens of this particular telescope with a bigger 80mm one for a bit more reach. That's kind of acceptable for a beginner, but still getting a bit ambitious. And this type of advice makes a lot of sense, especially since many beginners, if they don't know anything better about it, they might start with like a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope with a humongous focal length and have a lot of trouble with it, especially because the optics will be a bit slow, so they need to expose longer, and there are many issues with that. But I was wondering, is this piece of advice still valid? And is it valid in most situations? Are there cases where going with a small refractor might actually be more difficult than going with something bigger, like this Newtonian that I have here that has more reach, it's heavier, it's bigger, it's larger, it's more difficult to handle, and yet it might still be the better choice for some beginners in astrophotography, or maybe not a Newtonian, but a bigger refractor with an aperture of maybe 100 or 110 millimeters kind of thing. But why would that be? Why would this be more difficult than that bigger Newtonian that I have on the other side? Well, let's go first into the arguments in favor of using a small refractor for astrophotography. And the arguments are simple and they make sense. If you're using a small refractor, it means that you have a small focal length, meaning you don't zoom into the targets as much. Which means that if you go down to the pixel level of your camera, typically your pixels cover a larger amount of the sky than if you're using a larger refractor or a Newtonian telescope or a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, simply because you're zooming less. And because your pixels, they cover a wider chunk of the sky, then even if when you're tracking the stars as the Earth rotates, and thus from our point of view, the stars move together with the planet, then even if you have like small mistakes in guiding, by and large, that chunk of sky that you're imaging always falls onto the same pixel. So you can avoid issues and like you can have like less good guiding, you can have less good tracking of the target without seeing any impact on your image. And that makes small refractors like this one very forgiving of any mistakes that you could make during the capturing of an object. And in addition to that, because a small refractor is light, you can mount it on really small and cheap mounts. Something like the Skywatcher GTI mount, or the Skywatcher EQM35, I think is the name. Or if you want to be a bit more ambitious, the HEQ5. All of those are kind of like low-grade mounts. There's also similar mounts from like Ioptron as well, or other brands, but they're like fairly cheap, they're fairly small, they're fairly light, they're fairly easy to handle, and they pair well with a small refractor. That's kind of like a match made in heaven for budget or relatively budget astrophotography. But you'll have noticed that this basically focuses or only considers the capturing part of astrophotography. You get your telescope out, you set it up, you track an image as you take exposures throughout the night. And while you're doing that, you want to have good guiding, meaning that you're tracking the object well. You're not seeing star trailing or oblong stars in your image. With a small refractor, you are more resistant to wind as well. Small refractors make a lot of the imaging and the actual capturing process easier on paper. But one thing that I realized recently is I was enjoying capturing with this particular setup here much less, and I was enjoying that particular setup here, even though this particular setup is definitely more complex. By the way, this orange box here, it's basically an alternative to the ASI Air, and it supports most camera brands. I'll be doing a review of that very soon, so make sure to subscribe and click that bell icon if you don't want to miss it. And while you're on your way, you could like the video, leave a comment. It truly helps the channel out. But going back to this, I was realizing that for me, I enjoyed imaging with this much more. than I did with the other telescope. And the reason for that, the main reason for that, is that after I had taken my images, after I had taken my captures, after the night of imaging was done, I could go and process the image, and I found the processing of the images taken with this setup here was far easier than the processing of images taken with that telescope. So why would that be the case? How does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because I am located in Tokyo. So it's a very light polluted city. And what happens when you're using a small refractor like this one is typically, even with small sensor cameras like the ASI 533 MC Pro or the 585 sensors out there, like my excellent Toptech camera. By the way, if you're interested in any of the equipment I'm featuring, I'll put the links down in the description. But what that also means is while we have a very large field of view and we can capture large objects like extended nebulae or large galaxies from our point of view, like the Andromeda galaxy, it also means that we are capturing a lot more of the low signal to noise ratio areas. It means that in my images, I have such a wide field that I'm capturing a lot of space dust that has very low signal to noise ratio. So very often when I'm capturing in Tokyo and when many beginners capture those images, they have an area with very good signal to noise ratio, the brightest parts of nebulae, like the Orion Nebula or the North American Nebula. There's like this core that is super bright and it's very easy to capture. But we're also capturing around that, and around that has very diffuse nebulosity, sometimes dark nebulosity. And if you're imaging from a very dark area, that's not a problem. That gives you awesome images, and I love this kind of setup in dark areas. But if you're imaging from light polluted areas, it becomes extremely hard. I would even venture to say almost impossible to get a good signal to noise ratio outside the main nebula subject that you have chosen. And what happens when you have nebulosity that is so faint that it has such low signal to noise ratio? Well, on your image, it just appears as noise. And it becomes really hard to process. And very often, we will process it out the easiest and laziest way, which is cropping it out, or darkening it out by cutting out the darks in the image, something that beginners get told to not do quite a lot, but they kind of still have to do anyway because they have those low signal to noise ratio areas that they don't know what to do with. And even I, after 10 years or more in the hobby, I don't know what to do with either. And in contrast, this particular setup, it's a longer focal length of around 517 millimeters. So it's not an outrageous focal length, but it's still fairly long. And it's paired with a small camera sensor that has also small pixels, which is my Toptech with the IMX 585 sensor. I love this camera. I use it all the time. Links in the description again if you're interested. But anyway, what I noticed in that is that when I'm processing those images, I was imaging like a small nebula. So I have like the main nebula subject is at the center of the frame, and there's pretty much nothing else. There is no low signal to noise ratio area. Or I was also imaging the Heart Nebula, but I've always had issues with the Heart Nebula in the past with my wide field setups precisely because of the low signal to noise ratio areas. But with this one, I can simply image the center of the Heart Nebula. That's my whole field of view, the Melot, whatever the number is, area, the heart of the Heart Nebula. And I'm having a lot of fun because I don't have to deal with all of those low signal to noise ratio areas. So the processing aspect, especially from light polluted areas, becomes so much easier to deal with if you are having a longer focal length paired with like small-ish pixels in a camera that restricts the field of view, because otherwise I realized I would end up cropping quite a lot. And that's like on paper, an APS-C size sensor, larger sensor format is better always because you're capturing more of the image. But then in reality, very often I find myself like just going back to smaller sensors because it's more fun. I don't have to crop. I can actually frame and focus on small areas of nebulae and galaxy that I want to image. And it's a completely different feeling, and it makes the processing so much easier. And if you pair this, like relatively, like still short focal lengths, but still decent, together with small pixels, fast focal ratio, and you add techniques that I've detailed in other videos like dithering and drizzling, together with the recent automated deconvolution by Blur Exterminator, and then resampling down to the original sensor image scale, then you can get amazing results, even from a city like Tokyo that, in addition to having poor light pollution, or horrible light pollution, it also has very poor seeing, meaning the atmosphere is very turbulent and it blurs out the details in the images. And I will add that, in my experience, one thing that has made a big difference in recent years has been the introduction of mounts like this one, the ZW AM5. I also will be reviewing another mount from Warp Astron that's the same type of mounts very soon. So again, subscribe if you don't want to miss that. But what is very special about those mounts is that they are driven by what we call strain wave gears, or harmonic drives, which is like a trademark. But yeah, strain wave gears. And they typically don't require counterweights. And they don't really care about how much weight you are putting on the mount. So I could have like this telescope, which is fairly heavy, doesn't care. I can have a small refractor on it, doesn't care. I can have a big refractor on it, doesn't care. And what I've experienced is that with this mount, imaging, the actual capturing and tracking of the stars part, is just as easy, whether I'm using like a small refractor, large refractor, or a Newtonian telescope. It's just the same. It works extremely well in that way, and it allows me to not really care what I put on the mount. And this has been a revolution. You have similar mounts from Ioptron, like the M15 would be in the same price range. You have a downsized mount from ZW called the AM3 that is around 105,000 US dollars, so maybe twice the price of something like the Skywatcher GTI, which would be like a super entry-level mount, but it is so worth it for the flexibility that it provides you, and the fact that with guiding, you can get really good precision out of these mounts, and you don't need to care about counterweights, you don't really need to care about the weight of the equipment, it just works. And it's been a revolution in astrophotography, and I don't think we've appreciated yet how much of a revolution it is. It is not only in terms of portability and weight to how much it can carry ratio, so weight to payload ratio, it is about how we image. I was actually an early adopter of harmonic drive or strain wave gear drive mounts, but the one that I had received was apparently a lemon, so I had a very bad experience with that a few years ago that I detailed on the channel. But now I am fully convinced. I am absolutely on board with those mounts, and if I buy another mount in the future, it is extremely likely it's going to be a strain wave gear mount, because it makes everything easier once you're used to it. So if you're a beginner and you have a very limited budget and you like to have wild field of views regardless of whether you are like in a light polluted area or not, then yeah, go for this. This is awesome. It's a lot of fun. It's small refractor. You can have really cheap mounts that drive this. You can use star trackers, humble star trackers. It's a lot of fun. It's awesome. And you can pair them either with like small sensor cameras and still have a large field of view, or you can get a humongous field of view like with this APS-C size sensor camera as well. Works great. But if you're willing to put slightly more effort, but also a bit more money, because those strain wave gear mounts, even though they've come down in price in recent years, and I think they will still come down in price, hopefully, because inflation is inflation, but in coming years, they're really making everything possible. And if you go with one of those, like the ZW AM3 or the Warp Astron strain wave gear mounts, or the Ioptron M15, or the, what was the name, like Pegasus Astro, I don't remember the name of that brand, that also has strain wave gear drives. They're all over the place now. But if you get one of those that works well, and you can pair it with anything you like. And the only issue that I would tell you about is, if you do plan as a beginner to go with a Newtonian telescope like this one, know that Newtonian telescopes, they can be difficult to get to grips with at first, especially in terms of collimation. I have a whole series of videos on the trials and tribulations that I've had with this telescope here on my YouTube channel, but now it is tuned in absolutely amazing. I love this telescope almost more than any other telescope I've owned, with the possible exception of my Hyperstar C6 telescope, which is now broken, or my Vixen R200 SS Newton telescope that was absolutely amazing as well. So if you don't want to get stuck into like collimation hell and you want to have like something that's easier to set up, a large refractor aperture of 105, 107, 110, those are very common these days, work really well. Newtonians are a budget option if you're willing to buy like a collimation tool like the Ocal collimator, which is awesome as well, and do a good collimation of your telescope, and then you set it up properly. It's really worth it, and it's good for budget astrophotography. Or you could even go, if you're in an area with good seeing and not too strong winds, and you went with a harmonic drive mount, something like a small Schmidt-Cassegrain, like a Celestron C6 together with a Star Arizona reducer, or even a Celestron C8 or Edge HD 800 with its 0.7 reducer. And then you can also add a Hyperstar on that. It's very flexible, can give you great results even as a beginner. And especially if you're in a light polluted city, being able to to zero in onto the part of the objects that you like, and part, just like the Pelican Nebula, just the Monkey Head Nebula, just the center of the Orion Nebula, just the Running Man Nebula, just the Heart of the Heart Nebula. It is so much fun. It makes processing so much easier because you've restricted yourself to high signal to noise ratio stuff. It's fun to process. It's like good results immediately. It's super rewarding. I absolutely love it. And at the same time, the actual capturing part, it's not that hard. It's almost the same as with a small refractor. So what's to lose? And so to me, it kind of like becomes a matter of personal preference. And I think in the coming years, we'll have people coming from a gateway drug to the hobby like the C-Star S50, which is an amazing smart telescope, by the way. And they'll want to go deeper into astrophotography, and maybe they'd want to go first with this kind of small refractor, but their C-Star S50 already has got them covered yet. And the C-Star S50, by the way, it uses the same trick of a small field of view by having a small sensor with small pixels in it so that it can restrict itself to large signal to noise ratio areas. It's a good trick, ZW, well done. But that's kind of like overlapping with the capabilities of the C-Star. So why not go with something larger like this, or a large refractor of an SCT? That's kind of like my way of looking into things, like the recent cameras with like a range of pixel sizes that are available with very low read noise that support short exposures for even like good signal to noise ratio, because yes, the sensor capabilities have also rendered the need for super long exposures, especially in broadband, much less necessary, the need less necessary, sorry about that. And so you can make do with like 30-second exposures, 60-second exposures that don't require good guiding. So the capturing part is becoming easier and easier. And so why not go for something that can go a bit deeper, like a field of view, like a focal length of maybe between 500 and 700, maybe even more if you're ambitious. And then you compare it with whatever camera sensor size you feel fit your focal length and your seeing conditions. And I would tell beginners to not be afraid of trying out larger setups if they go with those newest generation strain wave gear mounts that truly make astrophotography much easier. And they also go with a recent CMOS sensor camera, like this one with the IMX 585 sensor, or the one I have on the other telescope, which is with the IMX 571 sensors, because they've truly made the hobby more accessible, easier, and that old recommendation that you absolutely as a beginner have to start with a small refractor telescope suddenly becomes much less valid, at least in my opinion, than it used to be. What are your thoughts on that? Let me know down in the comments. And it's super important that you let us know, because if you're a beginner watching a video, I really invite you to check the comments, because you'll have tons of opinions telling you like, no, Quiv is completely wrong. You'll still have this and that and this issue, right? It's always good to look at other opinions to really inform yourself. And you can leave your own comment there telling us how you started astrophotography. Maybe you started with a Schmidt-Cassegrain and you were super happy with it, or you were completely depressed and you left the hobby for years on end. Who knows? It's super interesting to see that. It helps the video get noticed. And by the way, something else that helps my videos and myself, it's my Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing. And also, of course, my YouTube channel members. You guys make the channel possible. That's all there is. So thank you so much for your support. By the way, I am shooting this video on December 31st, 2023. So we're almost at the new year. I don't know when I'll publish it. Maybe I'll be able to edit it and publish it today. We shall see. But depending on when you see it, Happy New Year. I wish you like all the best for 2024 and lots of clear skies. If you want to support me, feel free to subscribe. Join my Patreon, link in the description. Join the channel as a member. Again, every bit helps. It's absolutely amazing. All the support that I've received from the community helps me make those videos, which I hope are useful. I'm rambling, aren't I? I'm so sorry about that. It's just, I'm so grateful. Anyway, more important than all of that stuff, don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars and to image them. And I'll see you next time in 2024.